Hello, today is Wednesday, December 18th, 2019. This is the Cluster API office hours meeting. Cluster API is a sub-project of SIG Cluster Lifecycle. We do have meeting etiquette, so please take a look at what we have here. Basically use the raise hand feature of Zoom if you'd like to discuss something, and I will call on you. And in general, please be nice to each other. This meeting is being recorded and we'll be posting the recording on YouTube later. Please add yourself to the attending list if you haven't done so already, and we will get started here. So first up on the agenda, if anybody is new and interested in introducing themselves, we want to take a minute or so to do that. This is entirely optional, so if you don't want to do it or don't feel comfortable, that's totally fine. But if anybody wants to say hi who's new, please raise your hand and let me know.
Hey everybody, I'm new. Nick Stogner. Just started trying to contribute to the Cluster API, I think last week.
Thanks, welcome Nick. All right. Well, let's see. Does anybody have any PSAs that are not just discussion topics? I don't see anything in the document at this time.
I guess we could make a little PSA that we've moved our repositories to Go 113, and we're planning to up our Kubernetes minimum version for the management cluster to 116 and CRD-V1 on master. So expect like some breaking changes if you're following master and V1 Alpha 3.
And just to clarify, the 116 minimum requirement is for the management cluster. We'll still support deploying, I guess, 113 and up or 114 and up maybe. Okay, so I do have a demo for Tilt. Recently spent several days last week and a little bit this week working on adding a Tilt file to Cluster API. If you're not familiar with Tilt, it is a very nice way to do rapid iterative development for Kubernetes-based projects. We do, let's see if the docs made it in. We do have a document here. If you go to the master version of our documentation, and it does walk you through what you need to do to get this going. So basically you need Docker, you need a fairly recent version of Kind, you need Tilt, and then you'll need to do Git clones of at least Cluster API. And if you have specific providers beyond Cluster API and CAPD, the Docker provider, you would also want to clone those locally to your system as well. So I'm going to demo this, but before I do it, I think it's probably worth walking through the documentation so you can see what's here. You start and you just create a Kind cluster. I will also note you don't have to use Kind for this. I know that Nadir tends to use a different cluster, just a local one. So there is a setting in here where you can turn off the some of the stuff that it does with Kind once we get that pull request merged from Nadir. After you create your cluster, there's a Tilt settings file that you would stick in the Cluster API repository. This is in gitignore, so anything that you put in here will not be committed to the repository. There are basically 3 required fields that, or I guess 2, I should say. Allowed contexts. This is a Tilt command that lets you tell it which Kubernetes context in your kubeconfig you want Tilt to work with. If you leave this blank, then Tilt will not deploy anything because it wants to be certain and it wants you to be deliberate in specifying which kubeconfig contexts are appropriate to deploy into. The default registry setting is if you're building images and you need to push them to a registry because you're not using kind locally, for example, then a lot of the images for whatever you're building, especially Cluster API, will go into an upstream registry. So for Cluster API, we push to the Google Container Registry, and you most likely won't have permission and won't want to push into the Cluster API registry. So you would set this to something on the Docker Hub or any place that you have push access to, and Tilt is smart enough to retag the images into whatever you have and then push them into your registry. The next up is provider repos. This lets you bring in other providers outside of just Cluster API. And typically, these are going to be in the, they'll be relative siblings to your Cluster API checkout. And then the last one is enable providers. And this tells you specifically which ones you want Tilt to load and deploy. Out of the box, it will do the Docker provider. And then that's if you don't specify anything for enable providers. And then you additionally could set this and say, I'd like AWS or any of the other ones that support it. And then once we do that, we'll just do Tilt up. So let me go ahead and get my terminal over here and get my share set up to show that. So give me just a second to do that. All right, so I'm going to share my whole desktop here. Can you all see my terminal, although not read the font size?
Yep.
Okay, so let me get this up, get into the right branch. All right, so I have the master branch of Cluster API checked out. This is the AWS provider. This has the master branch checked out. And if we take a look at my Tilt, actually, I'm not going to show you my Tilt settings because they have some AWS credentials in there, but I can grep for enable providers in Tilt settings, and you can see I just have AWS set to deploy. So I'm going to run Tilt up, and this will open up both a browser and a HUD. Oh, actually, first thing I have to do is get kind up and running. So let me create a cluster. So this will take just a little bit. Kind is pretty fast. And once you have kind up and running, then you can do Tilt up. I did want to show this from scratch, so I'm glad I didn't have it up to begin with. So what the Tilt file is going to do while we're waiting is it will pre-pull and preload the cert manager images into kind. This is an optimization just because if you don't do this, then every time you reset, create a new kind cluster, you've got to wait for it to pull multiple megabytes over the network. So this just speeds things up a little bit. And then it will build your Cluster API manager binary, any of your provider manager binaries, and deploy all of them. And the best part is that it supports optimized live reloading. So when you are working on your Go code, or really any of the other files that it's watching, then Tilt will build your changes to the managers locally on your system. It will copy the compiled manager binary into the running pod and running container, and then it'll issue a restart on the process rather than, so it doesn't have to build the Docker image and load it and kill the pod and update the deployment and whatnot. This is just a live reload. It's about as close as you can get to a very, very fast live reload without having to start the process, but it does have to restart it. So what it's doing right now is Cert Manager. So it's deployed Cert Manager, and it's just waiting for the API service to be available. I was informed yesterday that a newer version of Cert Manager gets rid of the API service, so we'll probably have to change this check in the future. But for now, this is a good way to know that Cert Manager is ready to go. And this won't take too long. All right, it's up and ready. So now you see a whole lot more stuff here. This has taken all of the customized YAML from Cluster API itself, and because I have the AWS provider enabled from that. And so you can see we have a couple of namespaces going in. We have all of the custom resource definitions for Cluster API, the Bootstrap provider for KubeADM, and the AWS provider. And then all of the RBAC is going in. For AWS, I have a secret that's got my base64 encoded AWS credentials. We have some cert manager bits, and all of this goes in first. Then what you see is it's going to build the Cluster API manager, also known as Core Manager, the AWS manager, and you can see that it's just running go build. So this is happening on my laptop right now. And once it does those two, it will build a Tilt-specific Docker file that's very, very minimal. So this is not the production Docker file that we're using to build the images that we release. This literally just will take a couple of start and restart helper shell scripts, and it'll copy in the binary that we just built in the previous step. And then, so it's doing this. This was for Cluster API. This is for the AWS provider. And then you can see it's actually getting some logs out. And at this point, everything is up and running. So what's cool is I can take, pull my editor over here, and we'll go ahead and open up, say, the cluster controller for Cluster API. And I can come in here and we'll add a log statement. So I can say, hello, Cappy meeting. I'm going to save this. And if we come back over here, you'll see that it noticed this file changed, and it's rebuilding the manager for Cluster API. And this shouldn't take too long, especially thanks to Nadir, who fixed the full build issue. And now what you see is it is, whoops, get it back. A lot of log output. So what you'll see is that it's rebuilding the Docker image for Cappy Controller Manager, but instead of doing a full Docker build, it copies the file that we just built and invokes this restart script that the Tilt folks put together. And here you can see our log message is showing up. So we have a couple of outstanding PRs that we need to get merged before this is fully ready to go, but they'll get in today. And this is the basics for it. I do just want to cover one more thing, which is if you are working on a provider and you want to support this Tilt-based flow, all you have to do is add a tilt-provider JSON file to your repository, and you have to put in the name that you want to use to reference it. So this saying AWS here means that I can reference it in enable providers as AWS. And then there's a config. You specify the image that you would normally be deploying if it weren't a Tilt-based deployment. And then you list all of the files that you want to have Tilt watch so that it can do a rebuild if any of these change. And this is files and directories. So that is my demo. Any questions? I did see there was some chat, but if anybody's got any questions, please let me know. All right. If you try it out and you have problems, please feel free to open GitHub issues, reach out on Slack. We are super, super happy that this is in and that everybody can take advantage of it. There are, I mentioned, a couple of pull requests that are outstanding. One of them from Nadir makes it so that the Docker provider actually works. That was something that I hadn't tested doing this initially, but what Nadir added is some of the additional bits that the Docker provider needs in order for this to work. And then Vince has a pull request out that we, again, will get merged today, that switches our container image to the distrolist debug image, which includes the root CA certificates that are needed to actually talk to EC2 and GCP and whatnot. And we'll get both of these in, and then everybody will be able to use it. So this is meant to be a community thing like the rest of the project. So if there are things that you don't understand in the tilt file or features that you want to add, please reach out. I think this is going to be really helpful to everybody. All right. Seeing no questions, I'm going to move on to what is currently the only discussion topic. And this is from Michael Gugino, who was not able to make it today, but he did want to point out that a follow-up to what we had discussed, I believe, last week, was he created a KEP for a node maintenance lease. This is to avoid having multiple components that are all trying to do things with a node stomp on each other's toes. So if you need to drain a node, or you need to stop a machine and reboot it, or do other node maintenance activities, this is an idea around having a coordinated lease and ownership around that. So I would encourage y'all to take a look at this and add comments and questions as you see fit. I did want to check in on the, let me see if I have it. Hold on just a second. Oh, I don't have it, so we'll have to go get it. The machine remediation proposal, machine health checking proposal. Alberto, we had said that today would be the lazy consensus end. I did see that there were still some small comments that were outstanding. I don't believe that there's anything that is blocking this going in, and that we can continue to iterate as needed. But did you have any last minute changes you wanted to make before we merge this?
Hey, Andy, not really. I don't have anything unless anyone here thinks that there is any blocker. I'll be happy to move on.
Okay, so I think we can go ahead and get this merged in, and if there's any changes that we need to the proposal, they can come in a follow-up pull request. And have you all started working on any of this code?
Yeah, so we've got a version of this in OpenShift. So yeah, I mean, the idea is to move that code upstream. Basically, don't want to reinvent the whole thing, but port it back.
Okay. And do you have engineers who can work on doing the porting?
Yeah, sure. So assuming we get this merged today, so hopefully we can start to work on this right away after Christmas, if that makes sense.
Okay, that sounds good to me. Well, just like we did last week with the machine pool, let's go ahead and get this in. Alrighty. Does anybody have any other discussion topics before we go on to the new issue grooming? All right, if you think of something, let me know. But I'm gonna go over to the list of issues that don't have milestones. So I know we talked about this, I'm going bottom up. I know we talked about this one before about supporting clusters that don't have a load balancer, and I need to double check with Yassine and Andrew about, because I know we had talked about what to do with this one. So I'll come back to that and handle that. The project roadmap, I think it is fair to say that this is going to be documentation. It is going to come in, and we will put it for our milestone. If you all have not seen it, there is a Google Doc that is very, very rough, seeded with some initial thoughts, but nothing is set in stone. So I would encourage you to take a look at this, add your own ideas, have some discussion around when things should come in. And Tim had a good suggestion that we should probably try to figure out what do we consider a 1.0 beta and what's above and below the line. So please take a look. And I think, it's mid-December, we're getting into the holiday season. So I may open up a pull request, probably not this week. It'll probably be after New Year's to give people some more time to look at this, but I want to turn this into a markdown file that's part of the repository, and then we can continue to iterate basically constantly on it. Alrighty, let's see. Next up is automate as much of the release as possible. And I know that I was supposed to follow up from last week to at least show a couple of folks how we do releases, and I was not able to do that. So this is probably going to end up being another New Year thing. We did get a change to our PROW image building jobs to build tagged Git tags in an unsupported way, at least because PROW doesn't officially support it. But the next time we cut a release of Cluster API, the KubeADM Bootstrapper, the AWS provider, or the GCP provider, we'll be able to try out the automated image building. But I'm going to put this in next for now, mainly because our Alpha 3 milestone is big enough, and if we can get around to this, great, but I don't want to have this be a release blocker. And all right, Tim, this one's yours. You're still here.
Yeah, I think as part of this release and even previous releases, we should submit certification or CNCF certification. I think this is probably a reasonable expectation for consumers of Cluster API. So we do this for KubeADM as part of the release, and we have the instructions listed there. So I think it's worthwhile to do it for CAPI for V1 Alpha 2 Plus.
Who do you have, like a rotating group of folks for KubeADM that do it?
I wouldn't say rotating group of people. I would say that we do it every release, and sometimes people stand up for it to do the work. I do know that Lee has been active in that role.
Okay.
But I do think it could be part of the release punch list, to be honest.
Could be, yeah. Chuck?
I think this could be a good help wanted issue as well, because it's standing up a cluster and running running Sonobuoy basically, and opening a PR and CNCF. So I could see this being a good help wanted issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think this issue basically could be closed with a documentation update to our release guidelines, and then it would be in the punch list. Like, I don't think that this is not going to be a long-lived issue that stays open, and we just need to do it when we do releases. Spencer.
Yeah, I was just going to say that we're doing this on the Talos side with every release too, right? We're using CAPI to stand up the conformance cluster that runs the tests and whatever. So if you guys, I'm happy to chip in and help.
Okay, thanks. Jason?
I was just going to say, at least for Kappa, for the Release 04 branch, we have automated conformance jobs that run using Sonobuoy. So what we could potentially do there is update that with the tagging that we're doing for automating the image builds. And we should be able to generate an automated conformance report that we could use for submitting every time a tag is pushed.
That would be great. Can you file, I assume we need an issue in Kappa for that to do that work, right?
Yep, I'll go ahead and I'll file an issue for that.
Okay, Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I guess this is really provider specific because it's not like there's a conformance verification for just cluster API.
I agree. We should probably open this up in separate provider repositories and
Yeah.
just reference this one. And then once it's been open, we can probably close it.
Okay. Need to open individual issues in each provider. Document. Okay. Alrighty, so I'm just gonna leave this one alone because we're gonna end up closing it as soon as we get the provider ones in place. All right, introduce the control plane provider. This is for Cluster Cuddle, right?
So I think that was my question. Fabrizio opened this up based on the discussions we were having around the separation of the manifest to be able to ship ones that didn't automatically have the Bootstrap provider and the control plane provider in there. Now we have the control plane provider separated out from the rest of the stuff, so that should be unblocked. But I think we still need to follow up on identifying the follow-up work that we need to tackle for having the control plane provider supported with Cluster Cuddle v2.
As a flag and category of things, right?
Exactly.
All right, so this is important soon and in the milestone. Thank you, Jason. Control plane health checks. Oh, this is just a control plane issue. So we will get this thing set up right. Alrighty, missing cluster label for machine deployment. Vince, I see you referenced this in your patch helper.
Yeah, I added a test for it, so it should be fixed with that issue.
All right. Thanks. So, oops, you get this one. And then we have the big discussion about post creating thunks. I think there's no way we can commit to this for 0.3, right, Tim?
You can, there will be resources outside of this team that will be working on it. So you can put it in long-term importance, and if it doesn't make it, we can bump. But
All right.
I think folks asynchronously will be definitely working on this.
Okay. And wire up cap D E to E.
Yep. I'm doing that actually. That's active right now. I should have a PR open in a few minutes.
Thank you. And that is all we have for issues without a milestone. So let's see. Any other topics, or y'all get half an hour back? All right. Well, we will not be meeting next week. So happy holidays, everybody, and see you after the new year.
Have a good one.